Every year, Americans spend more than $30 billion on pain relievers, joint supplements, and prescription anti-inflammatories. $30 billion. And yet, the rates of arthritis, chronic joint pain, and age-related stiffness keep climbing year after year. Meanwhile, somewhere in the ancient world, in the market stalls of Jerusalem, in the kitchen gardens of Han Dynasty China, in the physician quarters of Avicenna's Persia, healers were prescribing legumes not as a last resort. As a first response, today we're breaking down 12 beans that ancient traditions considered medicine, and that modern researchers are now studying with fresh urgency for joint pain, inflammation, and mobility. After 60, stay through the full list, because the research behind some of these will genuinely surprise you. Pay attention to Number 1. It's a bean. Most people have dismissed as background food their entire lives, and it may contain a compound that works on joint tissue at a level that pain relievers simply don't reach. And around number 6, we're going to pause for a story. It's from the Hebrew scriptures, a man so exhausted and broken that he lay down in the wilderness and asked to die. What revived him wasn't a miracle in the conventional sense. It was food. And what that food did to his body, at the cellular level, is something researchers are only now beginning to understand. Number 12. Atsuki beans. In the ancient Japanese medical text, Ishinpo, compiled in 984 CE and drawing on centuries of prior Chinese practice, Atsuki beans were listed among the foods recommended for clearing what practitioners called damp heat, a condition that produced swollen, hot, painful joints. The Binchao Gongmu. The great 16th century Chinese pharmacopoeia, compiled by Li Shizhen after 26 years of fieldwork, described Atsuki beans as capable of dispersing blood stagnation and reducing swelling in the limbs. This was not folk superstition. This was systematic clinical observation recorded across generations, independent of East Asian traditions. Traditional Ayurvedic practitioners in India used a closely related legume, the lal chori, or small red bean, for reducing kapha accumulation, a constitutional imbalance described as producing heaviness, sluggishness, and joint congestion. 3 civilizations. 3 independent medical systems. One consistent conclusion: small red beans help address swollen, painful joints. Modern analysis reveals why. Atsuki beans contain polyphenols including proanthocyanidins, the same class of compounds found in grape seeds and pine bark extract that supplement manufacturers charge significant money for. Proanthocyanidins have been shown in peer-reviewed studies to inhibit certain inflammatory enzymes, including cyclooxygenase, which is the same enzyme pathway that ibuprofen acts upon. One study published in the journal Phytotherapy Research found that proanthocyanidin-rich extracts reduced inflammatory markers in animal joint tissue. The researchers noted the results were consistent enough to warrant human clinical investigation. Atsuki beans are also unusually high in molybdenum, a trace mineral that supports the detoxification of sulfite compounds, a factor researchers have linked to inflammatory responses in sensitive individuals. Soak 1 cup of Atsuki beans overnight in cold water. Then simmer in fresh water for 40 to 50 minutes until just tender, not mushy. The skins should hold their shape. Combine the warm, drained beans with a tablespoon of toasted sesame oil, a teaspoon of rice vinegar, and thinly sliced green onion. Eat this at lunch, 2 to 3 times weekly. The sesame oil provides lignans that appear to work synergistically with the beans' polyphenols. The color of the broth they cook in will run a deep burgundy. That color is your evidence. The proanthocyanidins are present and intact. Ancient practitioners didn't have gas chromatography. They had centuries of watching what happened when people ate certain foods consistently. The research is now offering a molecular explanation for what they recorded. Number 11. Fava beans. In the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 17, when King David was fleeing during Absalom's revolt and his supporters arrived at Mahanaim, exhausted and famished, the supplies brought to them are listed with specificity: unusual for ancient military narrative wheat, barley, flour, parched grain, beans, lentils, honey, curds, sheep, and cheese. The beans mentioned in Hebrew, pole almost certainly referred to the broad bean, what we now call the fava. This was not comfort food. This was recovery food brought deliberately to men under extreme physical and psychological stress. Egyptian medical papyri, including the Ebers Papyrus, dated to approximately 1550 BCE, referenced broad beans in preparations for muscle fatigue and swelling. Roman agricultural writer Columella, writing in the 1st century CE, documented that Roman legionaries consumed favas regularly during long campaigns and that military physicians considered them among the most sustaining of field foods. The convergence across Egyptian, Hebrew, and Roman traditions marks fava beans as one of the most historically consistent functional foods in the ancient Mediterranean world. The modern explanation centers on L-dopa levodopa, a compound that fava beans contain in meaningful concentrations, particularly in the pods and young beans. L-dopa is the direct precursor to dopamine, and dopamine plays a role not only in mood but in regulating pain perception, motor control, and the body's neurological response to inflammation. This is why fava beans have attracted attention from neurologists studying Parkinson's disease. But its implications for pain management in healthy older adults are also being explored. A study from the University of Rochester found that fava bean consumption produced measurable increases in plasma L-dopa levels in healthy subjects. Additionally, favas are rich in visine and convisine compounds with antioxidant properties, as well as isoflavones that may support joint tissue health. A word of caution: individuals with G6PD deficiency, a genetic condition more common in Mediterranean and African populations, should avoid fava beans entirely due to risk of hemolytic reaction. For everyone else, moderate consumption is generally considered safe. Use fresh or frozen fava beans when possible. Shell them. Blanch in boiling water for 2 minutes. Then slip off the pale outer skin to reveal the bright green inner bean. That inner bean is where the active compounds concentrate most densely. Dress with cold-pressed olive oil, sea salt, and a squeeze of lemon. Eat warm or at room temperature. Do not cook them beyond tenderness. Prolonged heat degrades the L-dopa content. 1/2 cup of prepared favas, 2 to 3 times weekly, is a reasonable starting point. Roman field physicians didn't have double-blind trials. They had legions of men whose recovery they could observe in real time over decades. The conclusions they reached were careful and consistent. Number 10. Black-eyed peas. In traditional West African medicine, specifically the healing systems of the Yoruba, in what is now Nigeria cowpeas, the original form of what became the American black-eyed pea, were used in preparations for joint swelling and lower back pain. When enslaved, Africans were brought to the American South. They carried this knowledge with them, and black-eyed peas became embedded in Southern foodways in ways that outlasted the memory of their original medicinal purpose. Simultaneously, in the Ayurvedic tradition of India, lobia, the same cowpea, was prescribed for reducing vata imbalance. The constitutional disruption associated with dryness, stiffness, cracking joints, and pain in the extremities. The convergence here is remarkable. West African traditional medicine and South Asian Ayurvedic medicine, developed in complete geographic isolation from each other, landed on the same bean for the same constellation of symptoms. Black-eyed peas are among the richest legume sources of folate. A single cooked cup provides approximately 90% of the recommended daily intake. Folate is essential for homocysteine metabolism, and elevated homocysteine has been linked in multiple studies to increase systemic inflammation and accelerated cartilage breakdown. A study published in the journal Arthritis and Rheumatism found that patients with rheumatoid arthritis had significantly higher homocysteine levels than healthy controls, and that folate supplementation helped reduce those levels along with certain inflammatory markers. Black-eyed peas also contain phenolic compounds, including luteolin, a flavonoid that has been studied for its ability to inhibit NF-κB, one of the master regulatory switches for inflammatory gene expression in human cells. Researchers at the University of Maryland have identified luteolin as a compound worthy of further investigation in arthritis management. Soak dried black-eyed peas for 6 to 8 hours. Then, simmer for 45 minutes. Do not use canned versions with added sodium. Season with turmeric, 1 teaspoon per cup of beans as you cook them. The curcumin in turmeric and the luteolin in the peas appear to work on overlapping inflammatory pathways, and combining them may amplify the effect of both. Serve warm with a small amount of apple cider vinegar stirred in at the end. The acidity improves mineral absorption from the beans. 1 cup. 3 times weekly. Fits comfortably into most eating patterns. 2. Healing traditions. Separated by thousands of miles of ocean. The research is now examining the molecular reasons they arrived at the same answer. Number 9. Pinto beans. In the traditional medicine of the Aztec Empire, the codices compiled by Mesoamerican healers, particularly the Badianus manuscript of 1552, one of the earliest written records of indigenous American medicine, documented the use of native beans in poultices and preparations for painful, inflamed limbs. Pinto beans, domesticated in the highlands of Mexico thousands of years ago, were among the most widely cultivated. Indigenous healers observed that populations eating these beans regularly appeared to suffer less from the joint stiffness and inflammatory conditions that plagued groups with different diets. This observation was recorded carefully, generation after generation, simultaneously and independently. Spanish colonial physicians arriving in the Americas noted that indigenous populations showed remarkably low rates of certain inflammatory conditions compared to European populations of the same age. They attributed this to the bean-heavy diet, though they lacked the vocabulary to explain why. The explanation involves chiempherol, a flavonoid that pinto beans contain in concentrations higher than most commonly consumed legumes. Chiempherol has been studied extensively at the University of California, San Francisco, where researchers found it inhibited the production of prostaglandins, the inflammatory signaling molecules that drive joint pain and swelling through mechanisms similar to but distinct from those of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Unlike NSAIDs, chiempherol does not appear to compromise gastrointestinal lining integrity, which is a significant clinical advantage for older adults who often have vulnerable gut tissue. Pinto beans also contain resistant starch at rates of approximately 25% of their total carbohydrate content. This resistant starch feeds Bacteroidetes bacteria in the gut, which produce short-chain fatty acids that exert systemic anti-inflammatory effects throughout the body, including in joint tissue. Cook pinto beans from dry, never canned, when you can help it, as the resistant starch content drops significantly during industrial canning and high-heat processing. Soak overnight. Then simmer at a gentle bubble, not a rolling boil, for 60 to 90 minutes. The proteins and starches are more bioavailable from a low, slow cook. Season with 1 teaspoon of dried oregano and a bay leaf during cooking. Both contain rosmarinic acid, which complements the beans' chiempherol. A half cup to 1 cup serving, 4 times weekly, is both practical and evidence-consistent. Pre-Columbian healers documented what they saw across lifetimes of observation. The phytochemistry is now providing the mechanism behind those observations. Number 8. Chickpeas. In the Hebrew Scriptures, the Book of Ezekiel describes a siege bread, a survival ration made from wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and spelt, baked together and eaten during extreme privation. The beans mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 4 are almost certainly chickpeas, the most widely cultivated legume in the ancient Near East. The prophet was not promoting a recipe for wellness. He was describing survival food, and yet the food itself, dense with protein, minerals, and plant compounds, was precisely what a body under extreme inflammatory stress would need. Avicenna. The Persian physician, whose canon of medicine remained the standard medical textbook in European universities until the 17th century, devoted considerable attention to hummus al-himansi chickpeas, describing their capacity to support kidney function, blood quality, and joint comfort in older patients. His prescriptions were specific raw chickpeas for different purposes than cooked, and the water in which chickpeas were boiled, what we now call aquafaba, as a separate preparation for certain conditions. Avicenna was onto something that modern researchers have only recently examined. Chickpeas contain an unusual combination of saponins and biochanin A, an isoflavone that, according to research from the Linus Pauling Institute at Oregon State University, inhibits the enzyme 5-lipoxygenase, which drives leukotriene production. Leukotrienes are inflammatory mediators, particularly implicated in joint swelling and morning stiffness, the specific complaint most common in people over 60 with osteoarthritis. Biochanin A works on the leukotriene pathway rather than the prostaglandin pathway, meaning chickpeas and pinto beans are addressing inflammation through entirely different molecular doors simultaneously if consumed together. Chickpeas are also one of the highest legume sources of manganese, a mineral essential for the activation of superoxide dismutase, the body's most potent endogenous antioxidant enzyme that protects cartilage tissue from oxidative damage. Use dried chickpeas soaked for 12 hours. Then pressure cooked or slow simmered for 90 minutes to 2 hours. Prepare a simple paste, not commercial hummus, which typically contains excess sodium and processed seed oils, by blending cooked chickpeas with 1 tablespoon of raw tahini, the juice of 1 lemon, 1 garlic clove, and enough of the cooking water to reach a smooth consistency. The cooking water retains water-soluble compounds, including saponins. Eat a quarter cup of this preparation with raw vegetables at midday, 3 to 4 times weekly. A medieval Persian physician described its benefits for aging joints in the 11th century. An American research university confirmed the molecular mechanism in the 21st. That gap in between is not a mystery. It is a testament to how long careful observation runs ahead of explanation. Number 7. Lentils. In the earliest chapters of Genesis, the account of Esau trading his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of red stew, the word used in the original Hebrew is nazid adashim, a thick, red lentil soup. Ancient rabbinic commentary on this passage noted that lentils were the food of mourning and recovery in Hebrew culture. The dish brought to a house of grief, specifically because they sustained the body during extreme physical and emotional depletion. The book of Ezekiel lists lentils as part of the same survival bread described in the previous entry, and in the account of David's flight from Jerusalem in 2 Samuel chapter 17, the same passage we mentioned with fava beans lentils appear again in the emergency provisions brought to his exhausted men. 3 separate moments of crisis in Hebrew scripture. All 3 feature lentils. This is not coincidence. Ancient food culture, at its most functional, concentrated the most potent recovery foods for its most physically extreme moments. This is where we pause, because what lentils do in a moment of physical crisis is not poetic. It is biochemical. And there is a story in the Hebrew scriptures that describes a physical collapse so complete, so physiologically specific, that modern researchers who have read it carefully recognize it as something more than narrative. In 1 Kings chapter 19, the prophet Elijah had just experienced what we might now describe as a complete physiological and psychological breakdown. He had run for his life across the desert, covered 40 kilometers in extreme heat, and then collapsed beneath a juniper tree, asking God to let him die. The text says he lay there and slept. An angel woke him not with words, but with food, a cake baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate. He slept again. The angel woke him a second time. Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. Elijah ate and drank, and then traveled 40 days and 40 nights on the strength of that meal. That passage is not asking you to believe in angels. It is asking you to notice what happened physiologically. A man in a state of complete glycogen depletion, cortisol exhaustion, and probable hypoglycemia. A man whose muscles had been stripped of their energy stores across a terror-driven sprint through desert heat was restored by a simple food prepared over fire. The food in the Elijah account was bread-like and water, but in the broader context of the survival foods appearing throughout these same Hebrew narratives, lentils were a consistent companion to moments exactly like this one: recovery after depletion, restoration after collapse. Modern researchers studying combat nutrition and post-stress recovery have identified the lentil's unique macronutrient profile as ideal for exactly this physiological moment. Lentils provide slow-digesting complex carbohydrates that restore glycogen gradually, not the spike and crash of simple sugars, but a sustained restoration of cellular energy. They provide readily absorbed iron. Red lentils in particular, with approximately 37% of daily recommended intake per cup, essential for rebuilding red blood cells and restoring oxygen delivery to depleted tissues. And they contain the amino acid arginine, a precursor to nitric oxide, which helps restore vascular flow to muscles that have been under ischemic stress. But the compound receiving the most research attention for joint health specifically is chiampherol. Yes, the same flavonoid found in pinto beans, found here again in lentils. A pattern that suggests nature built redundancy into the anti-inflammatory food supply. A study published in the International Journal of Molecular Sciences in 2019 identified lentils as one of the most consistently anti-inflammatory legumes tested across multiple cell-based models of joint inflammation, with researchers attributing this partly to the combined action of chiampherol, quercetin, and the high molybdenum content. Prepare red lentils in their simplest form. 1 cup rinsed red lentils, 3 cups water, 1 teaspoon turmeric, 1 teaspoon cumin, and 2 cloves of garlic simmered together for 20 to 25 minutes until the lentils dissolve into a thick, golden broth. Eat warm. In the morning if possible, before other foods. The preparation takes less than 30 minutes. The iron and folate in lentils are better absorbed in the presence of vitamin C. A squeeze of lemon over the finished bowl increases bioavailability meaningfully. Never use canned lentils. The industrial canning process at temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Celsius degrades the heat-sensitive polyphenols significantly. Elijah was restored by food, not by rest alone, not by water alone. The ancient world understood that specific foods had the power to bring a broken body back to itself. The research is now mapping the molecular pathway from broken to restored. If this kind of ancient knowledge resonates with you, the idea that the foods described in the oldest texts in the world carry mechanisms that modern researchers are only now beginning to map, hit, like, and subscribe. What's coming in the next few entries goes even deeper. Number 6. Kidney beans. In the Ebers Papyrus, the most comprehensive surviving medical document from ancient Egypt, dated to approximately 1550 BCE, there are references to a red bean preparation used for conditions described as heaviness and swelling of the limbs. Egyptologists have debated which specific bean was meant, but the kidney bean's distinctive shape and its cultivation in the broader ancient world point to it as a strong candidate. More concretely, traditional healers in both the Andean highlands, where kidney beans were domesticated, and in medieval European herbalism, recorded these beans as beneficial for what was described as gout and rheumatism of the lower joints. In pre-antibiotic European hospital practice, kidney beans were a standard component of the diet given to patients with inflammatory joint conditions. Kidney beans contain one of the highest concentrations of anthocyanins among all legumes, particularly in the dark red variety. Anthocyanins are the pigments responsible for the deep red color, and they have been identified by researchers at Tufts University as potent inhibitors of COX-1 and COX-2 enzymes, the same enzymes targeted by both aspirin and ibuprofen. A study from the University of Michigan found that anthocyanin-rich foods reduced inflammatory biomarkers, including C-reactive protein, by measurable amounts over a 12-week dietary intervention. CRP is one of the primary blood markers used to assess systemic inflammation in arthritis patients. Kidney beans also contain phaseolamin, a compound that inhibits alpha amylase, the enzyme that breaks down starch, which may help moderate blood sugar spikes after meals. A factor increasingly linked to inflammatory joint flares. Never eat kidney beans, raw or undercooked. They contain lectin phytohemagglutinin at concentrations that cause significant gastrointestinal distress unless fully cooked. Soak dried kidney beans for at least 8 hours. Discard the soaking water. Then boil vigorously for the first 10 minutes before reducing to a simmer for the remaining hour. The vigorous boil destroys the lectins. Season the finished beans with smoked paprika, black pepper, and a tablespoon of tomato paste. The lycopene in tomato paste has been shown to have additive anti-inflammatory effects when combined with legume polyphenols. Ancient hospital practitioners used these beans before they had a name for COX enzymes. The color of the bean was the evidence. The depth of that red was telling them something they recorded with precision. Number 5. Navy beans. In the long seafaring history of the European powers, navy beans earned their name by becoming the standard ration for sailors on extended voyages. The British Royal Navy, the Portuguese explorers of the 15th century, and the American naval fleet all relied on these small white beans as the preserved protein that kept men functional across months at sea with no access to fresh food. Naval physicians noticed that sailors who ate their bean ration consistently showed better recovery from the injuries and physical stresses of shipboard life than those who traded or avoided their portion. This was practical medicine, born from observation across thousands of sea voyages. The phytochemical responsible for much of the interest from modern researchers is genistein, an isoflavone found in navy beans, alongside the better-known soy sources. Genistein has been studied at the Mayo Clinic for its potential to inhibit osteoclast activity, osteoclasts being the cells responsible for breaking down bone tissue. In aging joints, an imbalance between osteoclast activity and osteoblast bone-building activity contributes directly to the degradation of the bony surfaces within the joint, worsening osteoarthritis. Navy beans also provide a remarkable concentration of thiamine vitamin B1, with 1 cooked cup delivering approximately 60% of daily recommended intake. Thiamine deficiency has been linked in several studies to increased pain sensitivity and reduced nerve conduction velocity. 2 factors that directly worsen the experience of joint pain, independent of the underlying inflammation. Prepare navy beans by soaking overnight, then simmering slowly in water with a strip of kombu seaweed. The kombu adds glutamic acid, which improves the bean's mineral bioavailability, and also reduces the oligosaccharides that cause gas. Simmer for 90 minutes. Season simply with olive oil, salt, and fresh rosemary. The rosemary contributes rosmarinic acid and carnosic acid, both of which have been studied for complementary anti-inflammatory activity. 1 cup, 3 times weekly, paired with a source of vitamin C, maximizes the iron absorption from these beans. Navy beans are one of the most under-discussed foods in the joint health conversation, which is precisely why they belong on this list. Naval surgeons in the 18th century documented the physical difference that beans made. Phytochemists in the 21st century are explaining the molecular mechanism behind what those surgeons recorded in their logs. Number 4. Black beans. In the traditional medicine of the Maya civilization, one of the most sophisticated healing systems in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, black beans were consumed not only as food, but prepared as medicinal decoctions for conditions described as pain and swelling of the large joints. The Maya Dresden Codex, one of only 4 surviving pre-Columbian Maya books, contains agricultural and botanical records that include black bean cultivation at a scale suggesting it was considered a priority crop. In traditional Chinese medicine, black beans, wudou, are documented in texts, stretching back over 2,000 years as a tonic for the kidneys, which in TCM are considered the root organ governing bone health, joint integrity, and the vitality of the lower body. 2 independent civilizations on opposite sides of the world, using the same black bean for the same cluster of joint-related complaints. The compound researchers are most interested in is delphinidin, the primary anthocyanin, giving black beans their distinctive dark color. Delphinidin has been studied at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston for anti-cancer properties. but subsequent research at other institutions has found it also inhibits the NF-κB inflammatory cascade at concentrations achievable through dietary intake, meaning you don't need a supplement, you need a bowl of black beans. Additionally, black beans are one of the richest legume sources of quercetin, a flavonoid that has been shown in clinical research to reduce levels of interleukin-6, an inflammatory cytokine chronically elevated in patients with both rheumatoid arthritis and osteoarthritis. Interestingly, the cooking water from black beans, which runs a dramatic deep purple-black, retains substantial anthocyanin content. Do not discard it. Use it as the base for soups or stir it into other preparations. Cook black beans from dry soak 12 hours. Then simmer for 60 to 90 minutes with 1 teaspoon of epazote, a herb traditional in Mesoamerican black bean preparation that also reduces intestinal gas. The epazote addition is one of those preparation details that has been carried in traditional cooking knowledge for centuries without anyone knowing the biochemical reason, and yet it works. Eat 1 cup of black beans 3 to 4 times weekly. The darker the cooked bean, the higher the anthocyanin content you've preserved. The Maya recorded this food as medicinal. Chinese physicians recorded it independently. The anthocyanin researchers are now naming the molecule those healers were observing. Number 3. Mung beans. In the classical Ayurvedic texts, specifically the Karaka Samhita, one of the foundational texts of Indian medicine, compiled between the 2nd century BCE and the 2nd century CE, mung beans are described as mudga, and they occupy an unusual position in the Ayurvedic pharmacopoeia. While most beans are considered somewhat difficult to digest and are used cautiously, mung beans are described as tridoshic balancing to all 3 constitutional types, and are the only legume freely recommended even for individuals with weakened digestion, recovering from illness, or experiencing active inflammation. This is not a casual designation. In a medical system that makes extremely fine distinctions between foods based on their effects on different body types and conditions, calling a food universally beneficial is a strong clinical statement. The Benchao Gangmu of Li Shizhen described mung beans as cooling to excess heat in the joints and beneficial for eliminating toxic accumulation language that corresponds remarkably well to what modern researchers describe as oxidative load, an inflammatory burden in arthritic tissue. The compounds vitexin and isovitexin, the flavone glycosides, unique to mung beans among common legumes, have been studied at multiple institutions for their ability to inhibit the NLRP3 inflammasome, a protein complex that acts as an inflammatory amplifier in joint tissue. When the NLRP3 inflammasome is overactive, it drives the production of interleukin-1 beta, a cytokine that directly destroys cartilage. A study published in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology found that vitexin reduced NLRP3-driven cartilage degradation in cell models. Mung beans are also, uniquely among the legumes on this list, easily consumed sprouted, and the sprouting process dramatically amplifies the bioavailability of their active compounds. Sprouted mung beans contain approximately 3 times the antioxidant capacity of unsprouted cooked beans, because germination activates enzymatic processes that break down the anti-nutritional factors binding the polyphenols. Sprout mung beans at home by soaking 1 cup of dried mung beans in cold water for 8 hours. Then draining and rinsing them twice daily for 3 days. Keep them in a jar covered with cheesecloth at room temperature. By day 3, you'll have crisp, living sprouts. Eat them raw over salads or in rice paper rolls, or lightly steam them for 2 minutes to warm without destroying the active compounds. Do not fully cook sprouted mung beans, as heat above 80 degrees Celsius denatures vitexin and isovitexin. Alternatively, if preparing cooked mung beans, simmer for 30 to 40 minutes with a piece of fresh ginger root, which appears to work synergistically with vitexin through complementary anti-inflammatory pathways. Ayurvedic physicians called mung beans medicine 2,000 years ago. The inflammasome research is identifying precisely which inflammatory pathway they were observing. Number 2. Soybeans. In the most ancient of Chinese agricultural records, The Shenong Ben Chao Jing, or Divine Farmer's Classic, compiled around the 1st century CE, but drawing on oral traditions stretching back much further, soybeans are listed among the 5 sacred grains, a designation that placed them alongside rice, wheat, millet, and barley as the foundational foods of civilization. This wasn't purely agricultural status. The sacred grain designation carried medical implications. These were foods understood to support the body at its most fundamental level. Through illness, aging, and seasonal extremity, Japanese traditional medicine distinguished between different forms of processed soy precisely because different preparation methods yielded different therapeutic effects. Miso fermented soybean paste was specifically used for joint and muscle complaints in elderly patients. Natto fermented with Bacillus subtilis was prescribed for what practitioners described as blood stagnation, a condition whose symptoms align closely with the cardiovascular and inflammatory contributions to joint deterioration that modern researchers study. Soybeans contain genistein and daidzein, the isoflavones discussed briefly in the reference content, but there are 2 lesser discussed compounds deserving specific attention here. The first is equal, technically produced not from soybeans directly, but from daidzein by certain gut bacteria in people who carry the right microbiome profile. Approximately 30 to 40% of Western populations produce equal, roughly 50 to 60% of Asian populations do. Equal has been shown in research published in the journal Menopause to have significantly greater anti-inflammatory and bone protective effects than daidzein itself, which may partly explain why soy's benefits appear more consistent in Asian study populations who have been consuming it regularly for generations. Cultivating the microbiome diversity needed to process it effectively. The second compound is the soy peptide lunasin, discovered in the late 1980s at the University of California, Berkeley, which has been studied for its ability to bind to integrin receptors on the surface of cells involved in inflammatory signaling. Animal studies suggest lunasin may help reduce inflammatory gene expression in joint tissue. Though human clinical data is still limited, and this finding should be considered preliminary. Choose the least processed soy forms edamame steamed in the pod and eaten warm with a pinch of sea salt. Or tempeh, fermented whole soybeans, pressed into a firm cake, sliced and pan-fried in a small amount of avocado oil until the surface is golden. Tempeh's fermentation process pre-digests the phytic acid that would otherwise bind to the minerals in soy, making the calcium, magnesium, and manganese far more bioavailable. Eat 1 to 2 servings weekly. Not daily variety across the legume, family matters more than maximizing any single source. Individuals with thyroid conditions should discuss soy consumption with their physician, as the isoflavones can interact with thyroid hormone metabolism in some people. Chinese physicians gave soybeans sacred status because of what they observed across lifetimes of practice. The equal research is revealing that the benefit may depend partly on the state of your gut, which means that what ancient populations did in preparing and fermenting these foods was not just culinary tradition, it was medicine. They didn't have words to explain yet. Number 1. Cannellini beans. There is a moment in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15, that most people remember as the story of the prodigal son, the young man who squanders his inheritance in reckless living, finds himself starving among pigs in a foreign country, and decides to return home. The father sees him coming from a distance and runs. There is a feast. A fatted calf is killed. But before the feast, before the celebration, the text records something smaller, the son's first food. After returning from depletion, in Jewish tradition, the meal of consolation, the Sudat Havra'ah, brought to someone in the depths of mourning or depletion, was built around legumes, specifically white beans and lentils, round foods symbolizing the cycle of life, understood by the community to nourish the body when grief or depletion had stripped it bare. The cannellini bean, the great white bean of Italian and Tuscan tradition, is among the oldest cultivated forms of Phaseolus vulgaris in the Mediterranean world. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century German abbess and natural philosopher, whose medical writings were among the most systematic of medieval Europe, described white beans as strengthening to the tendons and the tissues of the joints. She was writing 8 centuries before the word protein had been coined. What she was observing was real. Cannellini beans hold the distinction of being the legume on this list, with the highest concentration of a specific class of compound called ferulic acid, a hydroxycinnamic acid, also found in the outer bran layer of whole grains, but present in cannellini beans in a form that survives cooking better than the grain-based version because it is bound to the bean's cell wall matrix differently. Ferulic acid has been studied at the University of Milan, appropriately enough, given the bean's Italian heritage, for its capacity to inhibit the enzyme xanthine oxidase. Xanthine oxidase is the same enzyme targeted by allopurinol, the standard pharmaceutical drug prescribed for gout. Gout is a specific form of inflammatory arthritis caused by the accumulation of uric acid crystals in joint spaces. And xanthine oxidase overactivity drives that uric acid accumulation. The suggestion from the University of Milan research, and it should be noted, this is early-stage research requiring replication in larger human trials, is that regular consumption of ferulic acid-rich foods may help support healthier uric acid metabolism. This would make cannellini beans particularly valuable for adults over 60 who experience gout flares or elevated uric acid levels, a group that is often told there is nothing dietary they can do between pharmaceutical doses. Beyond ferulic acid, cannellini beans are among the richest legume sources of phosphatidylcholine, a phospholipid that is a structural component of every cell membrane in the human body, and specifically of the synovial membrane lining every joint space. The synovial membrane produces the synovial fluid that lubricates the joint and protects cartilage from mechanical friction. In aging joints, the phospholipid composition of the synovial membrane changes in ways associated with reduced lubrication and increased friction-driven inflammation. Dietary phosphatidylcholine, unlike lecithin supplements, which are extracted and often poorly absorbed, appears in cannellini beans in a naturally bioavailable form surrounded by the whole food matrix that facilitates its uptake. Cannellini beans also provide meaningful amounts of magnesium, potassium, folate, and plant protein, but the combination of ferulic acid and phosphatidylcholine, taken together, represents a mechanism of action on joint health that is genuinely distinct from anything else on this list. They address the chemistry of the joint fluid itself. Prepare cannellini beans from dry to 12-hour soak, followed by a slow simmer in unsalted water for 90 minutes. Adding salt only in the final 15 minutes of cooking. Salt added earlier toughens the bean's outer skin and slows the cook. But the timing matters for a more important reason. The ferulic acid is more stable in low-sodium cooking water during the extended simmer. Finish the beans with high-quality, cold-pressed extra virgin olive oil, not heated, drizzled raw over the warm beans. The polyphenols in raw olive oil have been shown in research from the University of Athens to work synergistically with legume-based antioxidants, increasing their bioavailability. Add fresh sage leaves, briefly warmed in the oil before drizzling, as sage contains rosmarinic acid that contributes to the same anti-inflammatory pathways. Eat these beans at room temperature or slightly warm, not piping hot, 2 to 3 times weekly. 1 cup per serving is both sufficient and sustainable. The meal of consolation, brought to the bereaved and the depleted throughout Jewish tradition, was built on legumes. The community didn't need a clinical trial. They had watched for generations that these specific foods brought people back. The research is now examining the molecular mechanism by which a white bean addresses the chemical environment inside an aging joint. Hildegard of Bingen described it as strengthening to the tissues of the joints in the 12th century. The University of Milan's phytochemistry laboratory is measuring the same effect in the 21st. Here is the one thing most people will miss about everything we've discussed today. Every single compound we named the proanthocyanidins in adzuki beans, the vitexin in mung beans, the ferulic acid in cannellini beans, the lunasin in soybeans, the anthocyanins in black beans and kidney beans. Every single one of them is heat sensitive, light sensitive, or time sensitive to some degree. Industrial food processing, the canning lines running at temperatures above 115 degrees Celsius. The dried bean products that have been sitting under fluorescent lights on a shelf for 2 years. The commercially prepared bean dips, processed with seed oils and high-heat pasteurization. These processes do not merely reduce the nutritional value, they dismantle it. The specific molecules that make these beans worth eating are precisely the molecules that industrial food processing is least equipped to preserve. This is not a conspiracy. It is chemistry. The food companies are optimizing for shelf life, uniformity, and cost. They are not optimizing for ferulic acid stability or anthocyanin retention. That work, the work of actually getting the active compounds into your body intact, falls to you. In your kitchen. With dried beans soaked overnight and simmered gently, with herbs chosen for synergy rather than convenience. The ancient healers who prescribed these foods were not working with extracts or powders. They were working with whole foods prepared simply, eaten in season, and consumed consistently across a lifetime. The research is confirming that this approach, the whole food, the minimal processing, the preparation knowledge passed from generation to generation, was not primitive. It was precise in ways that modern food science is only beginning to fully appreciate. So the question that remains, after watching this video, is not which of these 12 beans you should eat. That question has been answered. The question is whether you still trust the systems that turned food into a product, and whether you're willing to return to something older, something that has been working, quietly and consistently, for 4,000 years. If this video gave you something genuinely useful information you haven't heard in the wellness conversations you've been part of, please share it with someone you care about. Someone with aching knees. Someone who's been told the pain is just aging. Someone who still has a kitchen and is willing to use it. Subscribe if you want more of this, the intersection of ancient texts, cross-cultural healing traditions, and the modern research that is slowly, carefully, and sometimes reluctantly catching up to what the ancients recorded. Leave a comment telling us which of these 12 beans you already eat, and which one surprised you most. And if there's a topic you want us to dig into ancient foods for the heart, for the kidneys, for cognitive function, tell us in the comments. This channel goes where the questions lead. Medical disclaimer. The information in this video is for educational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. Always consult your healthcare provider before making significant changes to your diet, especially if you are managing a medical condition or taking medications.